The brain is very different from a computer, the way it's structured. A computer basically has, the CPU is separate from the memory. And connecting the CPU with the memory, you have this thing called the bus, the memory bus. And the memory bus is working full time, continuously when a computer is turned on. And it's actually a bottleneck. So the CPU can be very powerful and the memory can be huge, but you're limited as to how much information you can transfer between the two. And that is a very limiting factor in the overall power of a standard computer. The brain, on the other hand, works massively in a massively parallel fashion. Every single neuron is doing the best it can all the time. Individually, each neuron is slow, but you put a lot together, slow in terms of a computer. We're talking milliseconds for a neuron and nanoseconds for a clock cycle in a computer. So the brain works by just putting a lot of slow elements together and just having a lot of them, all working continuously. And there's no memory bus, so everything works all the time in a brain. That's the difference between the neuromorphic chips and a standard computer. A neuromorphic chip tries to construct an architecture similar to the brain. So it doesn't have a bus, a data bus or a memory bus. And the idea is that all the processing elements in a neuromorphic chip are working constantly all the time, and they're all doing their thing. So there's no bottlenecks, and that makes them, theoretically, that makes them a lot faster. And also they can run with much lower power, because a lot of the power in a computer is spent actually transmitting the information between the CPU and the memory. You don't need to do that in a neuromorphic chip. The big issue with neuromorphic chips at the moment is that we can build the hardware within certain constraints, but we actually don't, because we don't really understand how the brain works, we don't really know what algorithms to run on these neuromorphic chips. That's just beginning. The attempts at doing that are really quite, it's very early days. Even the current best AI that we have is still very, very different to the brain. You might say it's brain inspired, but it's not copying the brain. So, one of the very big differences is the neurons in the brain communicate with little electrochemical potentials, basically. They're called spikes. They're like little static electricity charges. They're a little click. And you can actually listen to these things with a recording electrode, and they sound like little static clicks, like little tiny lightning bolts. And that's how neurons communicate in the brain. But in our currently most successful AIs, neurons communicate more with mathematical functions, with matrix functions. And so that's probably one of the biggest differences. Another very big difference is that in the brain there's massive amounts of feedback connections. So obviously we process sensory input, and that comes up into higher brain regions and gets further processed and abstracted from the original input that we see. But there's also massive amounts of feedback coming from those higher regions back to the perceptual areas. And this feedback directs where we look and gives us expectations of what we might see. And when those expectations are violated, when something unusual happens, we attend that. We are forced to attend that. We pay attention to it. All these things, all these concepts they basically don't occur in our current AIs. Our current AIs are modeled more on just the perceptual parts of the brain, and they ignore all the other things that the brain does.